Martin Buber's book, I and Thou, is perhaps the most well-known philosophy of dialogue. So I and Thou is written in German, and the German title is Ich und Du, I and You. And what's important about that title is that in German there are two forms of you. There's the formal, the Sie, and the informal, the Du. Du was reserved for family members and friends of a deeply intimate nature. Imagine that urgency in everyday language. And that's the German of Buber's moment. I and Thou tries to help us understand why our world is broken and how to fix it through interpersonal relationships. Buber often reflected back onto the moment his mother left him when he was 3 years old. And there was a sense of fear and confusion. And when his father couldn't raise him on his own, he was sent to his grandparents, who were Orthodox Jews living in Eastern Europe, raised him. It created an uncertainty in him because he didn't have the conventional relationship with parents that built that kind of trust that then allows for the use of the word do. So Buber opens his book on I and Thou by setting up two relationships and how we orient to the world. The first is I-it, and the second is I-thou. So I-it describes a relationship between the I, so you as a subject, an interesting person, interpreting the world. And you interpret the world through your five senses, but you understand that it's not you, that it's separated from you. And in many cases, that those relationships become objectified. The it becomes an object. And we, as a way of protecting ourselves from that objectification, use myriad labels to describe who we are. I'm Jewish, I'm American, I'm from a certain place, I now live in a certain place. And so in the I-it world, you run into the danger of racism, patriarchy, sexism, homophobia, religious bigotry. Because once you have the ability to objectify a human being, it allows you to understand it in a way that gives you some sense of power, some control, and some understanding. And that's the danger of I-it. Yet at the same time, you can't live in a world without I-it. There are certain relationships that require you to be an I and the other end to be an it. Every time I go to the Safeway and I buy something going through the conveyor belt, there's another person there. Each of us sees us as a means to an end. But it becomes a problem when I associate that interaction with some value. That there's something about that person and their work or their vocation that I can objectify and judge. But what's interesting is that for Buber, if that cashier and I exchanged a moment, we could have an I-thou relationship in which all of those I-it relationships that make up the empirical world, that make up reality, will disappear. We're no longer the people we were in that moment. We're something different, and both of us recognize that. That's called genuine mutuality, in which we recognize each other in our absolute subjectivity, in that you are a unique person at this moment in time, as am I, and we're sharing something. But you don't get to that point without an I-it world. So the world is incredibly complicated, and we use our five senses to try to understand the world, and in so doing, we create categories. And those categories allow us to understand how things are related a little bit better. It gives us a sense of confidence and a sense of comfort that in some way we're operating in a complicated world and that we understand it. What I-thou does is suspend that comfort for a moment, because in a relationship with a person, those senses are no longer relevant. They're no longer ways to categorize other people. You're unmoored from your I-it reality, and you don't know how to ground yourself, and you allow yourself to be in a moment with a person without the need to try to categorize or understand what that moment is. For some people, it's transcendent. For some people, it's simply time stopping. And for Buber, that disrupts the I-it world because it reminds us that no matter how well we know the world, there's something missing. There's something lost. And that something missing is where Buber would like to build community. For Buber, he would call that some sort of eternal thou, an engagement with God, or whatever other word you want to attach to the beyond. In our contemporary situation where people are trying to find meaning in a variety of places, he offers an opportunity for us to experience transcendence without the borders of religion, of identity, that you don't need to circumscribe all aspects of your life into one thing. And I think it would appeal to people who are charting a spiritual path, but without the need for institutional religions. So drawing from the Talmud, the Jewish tradition's interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, but also of oral laws, this concept of machloket, which is commonly translated as argument or disagreement, I'm more comfortable translating it as a form of sacred arguing, in which you can debate with your interlocutor about a whole set of issues, whether it's theological, political, cultural, whose sports team is better. So at the end of that debate, I should be able to articulate back to you what your intentions were, what the ideas were, to give it the most charitable meaning imaginable, so that when you hear it coming from me, you say, yes, that's what I was saying. Then I can engage it. Then I can debate with it. Then I can offer my critique. But something happens in that engagement in which the idea separates from the person and is no longer the individual that you're debating with. And in that moment, for Buber, it's both of us engaging something that has come out of one person simultaneously with the same genuine mutuality in which our armor that defines us, that we place as a way of protecting ourselves from the world, disappears. And when that armor disappears, we learn that our humanity is shared. Now, we come back to the world of I-it, because you can't live in a world that is exclusively I-thou. But what you recognize in that experience is that it's transformational. I no longer desire to see you as an it, because if you can relate to anyone with that I-thou encounter, what that means is that all the layers that people put on themselves to protect themselves from this unpredictable and scary world, including the meanings and values that they believe define their life, if you understand that those things can evaporate in a moment in the same way that it can evaporate with you, you can build community with people who have very different orientations to the world and very different values, when you recognize that the shared humanity between you is that you can equally live in the space where there is that something missing, or that deeply ineffable quality that connects you without your values, without your experiences, that I can see you in the nakedness of your being and not be afraid to share the nakedness of my own. When you come to that realization, community then becomes understood very differently. It's not a place in which you look for people who have the same orientation to politics, to religion. It's to people who have the same orientation to experience. These values are important in my everyday life in the same way that they are to someone else's, but they need not conflict with one another when we recognize that in certain moments, they don't determine our interpersonal relationship. Once you have that moment with the other, with someone different from yourself, it is transformational in such a way that you relate to every other person with the same potential for that kind of experience. And when you do that, it's a lot harder to categorize or objectify that person because they no longer are who they say they are or who you think they are. You can engage them in certain ways that allow for I-thou encounters. When you build community in that way, how we discuss politics, how we discuss religious difference will take on a different urgency. Like everything else that becomes meaningful, you want to find it everywhere, and it is worthwhile. And that what Buber calls the sublime melancholy of coming out of the I-thou encounter, it should be seen as an inspiration to find more. Buber offers you a path that can create a lifetime of meaning, and at the same time, the opportunity to build more meaningful and thoughtful communities that can build partnership across religious difference, political difference, but in a way in which we can mutually share this planet together and think of solutions as a broader community.